Listen for a moment last and hear me tell my tale. How o'er the seas from England's shore I was condemned to sail. The jury found me guilty, sir, and said the judge, said he, for life, Jim Jones, I sentence you across the stormy sea.
Welcome to another Newcastle Family History Society podcast. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. This series, Felonious Females, recounts the lives of some of the convict women who were sent to Newcastle and the Hunter Valley in the 1800s. In this episode, Dr Jude Conway recounts the life and times of the famous Molly Morgan.
Known as the Queen of the Hunter Valley, Molly Morgan was not your typical female convict. Born Mary Jones in the village of Corfton in the West Midlands of England in 1762, she was the daughter of a farm labourer. When she was 16, Molly was asked to look after the children of a recently widowed neighbour. By age 21, she had her own baby. She was not married, and the father was rumoured to be the widower. Her baby was baptised Mary. In 1785, Molly did marry William Morgan, a wheelwright and carpenter. Unlike 60% of brides and grooms at the time, she could sign her name on the marriage register, so she must have had some schooling. The following year, a son James was born. 1789 was a pivotal year in Molly's life. Clippings of hemp yarn disappeared from a Corfton bleaching yard. Perhaps Molly and William had past transgressions because a warrant was issued to search their house. The clippings were found and they were both arrested. William managed to escape and fled the district. The police locked Molly in a room in the local tavern. She was so distressed, she cut her throat. She was discovered in time and sewn up by a surgeon. When she recovered, Molly was tried for stealing 38 clippings of yarn worth £4, which made it a capital crime. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. Of course, there would be no Molly Morgan saga if a death sentence was not transmuted to transportation to the new penal colony of New South Wales for 14 years. The colony had an imbalance of males to females of 8-1, so the authorities were making efforts to transport more women. Molly's misfortunes continued when she was placed on the infamous Neptune, which sailed in the Second Fleet from Portsmouth on 19th of January 1790, with 420 male and 78 female convicts on board. Molly was aged 28. To make the best possible profit, the captain of the Neptune, one of the monsters of naval history, cut the convicts' rations to starvation level and locked them in irons in the crowded, stinking, unsanitary holds for the entire voyage. Fever, scurvy, and death were rife. By the time the Hell ship reached Port Jackson on 28th of June 1790, 158 convicts, that is, nearly 1 in 3, had died. 3/4 of the survivors needed to be hospitalised, and many of them also died. The Neptune had the highest mortality rate of all convict ships to sail to Australia. Molly's condition on arrival is fodder for lurid storytellers who cast her as a seductress. With no proof that I've found, they write that when Molly stepped ashore in Old Sydney town, she was healthy because the soldiers had plied her with rations for her favours. The best-looking convict women were known to be shared amongst the officers when being transported, so there could be truth in the accusation. Molly was taken to Parramatta, where life was difficult for both the military and the convicts, as the food they were used to eating was in short supply. Her husband, William, managed to follow her to New South Wales soon after, leaving their children with her brother. She and William set up a shop in Parramatta. But at the muster on Sunday, 9th of November 1794, it was realised that 3 convicts were missing, John and Mary Randall and Molly Morgan. There were 2 ships anchored in the harbour and government search parties boarded both. Captain Locke of the whaler Resolution ordered the soldiers off his ship and set sail the next day with the missing convicts on board. Had Molly used her charms to persuade Locke to smuggle her back to England, as is usually suggested? Maybe, or possibly the 3 convicts had bribed Captain Locke. On arriving back to her homeland, Molly made a beeline for her children. Mary was now 12 and James 9. She took them to live with her in London, then to Plymouth, where she set up a dressmaking business and found herself a businessman. In November 1797, aged 35, she married Thomas Mears, the owner of a bell-making foundry, presumably not telling him that she already had a husband in Sydney. Before long, there were disputes between Molly and her new husband. An apprentice at the foundry reckoned that Molly was the suspect when the husband's house caught fire. Molly scarpered to London. Her son James went back to live with his relatives, and we don't know what happened to her daughter Mary. Seemingly, Molly liked to take what was not hers, because in September 1803, a respectable widow reported that she found her petticoat and her napkin in Molly's possession. Cloth goods were valuable in those days. Molly was arrested, and although she pleaded not guilty, under the name of Mary Mears, she was convicted of a felony and sentenced to transportation to New South Wales for 7 years. She was among the 136 female and 2 male convicts packed onto the ship Experiment, which sailed on the 4th of December. A storm in the Bay of Biscay broke the ship's mast, and it had to return to England for repairs. It sailed again in January 1804, and Molly arrived at Port Jackson on 24th of June that year. I wonder what she was thinking as the ship sailed through Sydney Heads. Along with the majority of the other convict women, she was sent up the river to the Parramatta Female Factory, which at the time was on the top floor of the male prison. The women were employed spinning wool, sewing and washing. She was recognised as Molly Morgan, but nothing was done about her absconding or her bigamy. Her first husband, William, had a new family, so Molly acquired a new man friend, possibly a soldier from the Parramatta garrison. She was given the use of land near Parramatta and a few cattle, and established a flourishing farm. As was prevalent in the settlement, Molly began increasing her herd by branding government cattle as her own. In 1814, she was caught. Her male friend was not powerful enough to prevent her being tried, and when a cow was led to the courthouse door as evidence, Molly was found guilty. She was sentenced to 7 years' transportation to the Newcastle penal station, a hellhole of brutality for second offenders, or in convict jargon, the double distilled, making Molly a triple distilled convict. At the time, the convict women in Newcastle were provided with no official accommodation, so they had to share huts with the male convicts. But even at the age of 52, Molly had not lost her popularity with men and was invited to take up residence with an officer. Why was Molly so popular with men? Even if she was good-looking in earlier years and free with favours, she must have had more to offer. There are many stories about her drinking and dancing on bars and her ready wit, so she must have been lively company. During a visit to the Newcastle Penal Station in 1818, Governor Macquarie and Commandant Wallace went on an excursion overland and found an area of land along the Hunter River suitable for cultivation, probably partially cleared by cedar cutters. Macquarie named the river flats Wallace Plains and decided to establish a farming project there. He arranged for 11 well-behaved Newcastle convicts to be given tickets of leave and permitted to occupy 30 acres each, with the promise of eventual ownership. Molly was one of those convicts, the only woman to receive land in her own right, though not the only white woman at Wallace Plains. By 1820, there were 7 of them, wives, convicts assigned as domestic servants, and dairy women. Molly's farm was outermost in the settlement, adjacent to Horseshoe Bend in the river. With the help of assigned convicts, she cleared and cultivated the land and built a cabin. She grazed cattle, and even though floodwaters from the 1820 flood reached the window sills of her cabin, she again became a successful small farmer. She was so entrepreneurial, the river adjacent to her property came to be called Molly Morgan's Bend. Molly knew that to be granted title to her land, she needed to have a husband. Despite already being a bigamist, she received permission to marry, and on 5th of March 1822, at Christ Church, Newcastle, the Reverend G.A. Middleton married Molly and Thomas Hunt, also known as Joe the Marine, one of her assigned convicts and over 30 years younger. Legally, she was now Mary Hunt, but she was still known as Molly Morgan. In fact, her husband was often called Joe Morgan. All the farmers grew potatoes, wheat, maize, and barley. There was no plough. All cultivation was done by hoe. Farming was hard work. By 1823, Molly and Joe had cultivated 35 acres, and the improvements on her farm were valued at frame wattle and plaster cottage, £10, stockyard fence, £5, fenced garden, peach orchard, and huts and skillions, £5. The farmers would have had frequent contact with the Wanneroo people, and undoubtedly there was some conflict. 3 soldiers were based at the settlement, partly to prevent attacks. The penal camp at Newcastle had been shifted to Port Macquarie by the end of 1823, opening up the floodplains of the lower Hunter Valley to free settlers. The Morgans acted as go-betweens for the newly arrived colonists and Wanneroo guides, so they had obviously formed a working relationship with the original inhabitants. In fact, the new settlers came to realise that they were indebted to the ticket of leave farmers for the obliging disposition of the Aborigines in that part of the country. The distance by land between Newcastle and Wallace Plains was a third of that by water, but the track was difficult and crossed 2 swamps. So new settlers travelled up the Hunter River by ship to a wharf at Molly Morgan's Bend or further on to Morpeth, and then overland to their destinations. The story is that Molly set up a wine shanty at her wharf and traded a place to stay for some hard-to-get liquor to sell in her shanty. Wallace Plains began to be colloquially called Molly Morgan's Plains. Surveyor Henry Danger found the ticket of leave farmers' blocks were not of equal size. He allocated Molly's land to another convict and marked out 159 acres nearby for her with good frontage to the river. So Molly had to re-establish her farm. She was given a convict clearing gang to help. Notably, she could still do much of her own fencing and drain building. When one family travelled through the district in 1826, they noted Molly Morgan's huts, stockyards, slaughterhouse, tan pits, and her garden with the inevitable peach trees, which would have been used to make peach cider. The banks of the Hunter River were still covered with scrub, but bullock teamsters cut a winding track through Molly's new land, which eventually became the main street of the future town of Maitland. For the accommodation of well-off travellers, Molly built a substantial inn of ironbark slabs with a bark roof on her land and called it the Angel Inn. It offered plenty to eat and drink and good beds. Although the owner, Molly was never registered as the licensee. The 1826 licensee was George Yeomans. He later declined to have any more business dealings with the woman he labelled an old virago. So Molly didn't charm every man she met. Blocks along the river and the track were in demand by people wanting to set up stores and more inns. So Molly subdivided and leased portions of her land to open up what is now High Street, Maitland. It was said that one of the reasons people did not settle at Morpeth in greater numbers was that Molly Morgan and Joe the Marine were practically giving their land away. Molly also developed a good eye for cattle. In 1825, she wrote to the colonial secretary to say her land was not large enough for her stock of 300 head of corn cattle, 18 horses, and 100 sheep. She asked to be allowed to purchase more land so she could increase her stock numbers. Granted permission, she found and was affluent enough to buy 200 acres, about 20 kilometres from Maitland in the Greta area. It was slashed through by Anvil Creek and backed onto a range of hills, which is still known as Molly Morgan Ridge, while a nearby summit is still Mount Molly Morgan. The Australian newspaper, in January 1828, named her as one of the largest landholders on the Hunter River. The census that year showed the complexity of Molly's farming operations. Molly and Joe were listed as cattle holders and tanners, residing on their Wallace Plains land, along with 20 other people in huts on the property. There were 2 assigned convicts, 10 with completed sentences, 2 with conditional pardons, and 2 tickets of leave. Their occupations were stockman, labourer, dairyman, blacksmith, shoemaker, servant, and groom, suggesting an effectively run farm. Many acts of Molly Morgan's generosity have been recorded. She often rode miles to comfort sick settlers. She built a rough-and-ready hospital on her land where she treated sick men, usually with quaffs of medicinal rum. She gave a whopping £100 towards the building of a church school at Wallace Plains. And unlike many landholders who viciously abused their assigned convicts, Molly had a special interest in their welfare. In the 1820s, she is reputed to have ridden to Sydney a few times to intercede with the governor for convicts bound for the gallows. That was a long way to ride when you're in your 60s. Molly certainly earned the right to be known as Queen of the Hunter Valley. The summer of 1826 was the last wet season in the valley until the end of 1829. During these years, settlers had to purchase grain at high prices and the value of livestock plunged. Molly's wealth started ebbing away and she had to sell off or mortgage her holdings to have any income. After 1828, Joe and Molly moved their entire establishment to their Anvil Creek property, calling it Molly Morgan's Agricultural and Dairy Farm. The road to Singleton became known as Molly Morgan's Line of Road. By the 1830s, Molly was an old woman with a bent back, but still she had ready wit, ever-ready advice, and was capable of soundly berating those who annoyed her. Despite the hard times, she was still generous. Charles Bordell, travelling around the Hunter Valley in one of Molly's gigs, wrote in his journal, "We pursued our way until we came to Mrs. Hunt's, alias Molly Morgan, and left after partaking some excellent bread, cheese and porter, for which the good lady would accept no remuneration." On June the 26th, 1835, Molly Morgan, aged 73, died in her Anvil Creek home and was buried somewhere on the property. Her obituary in the Sydney Press stated that she was in the constant habit of lending the most valuable assistance to all who asked for it. Without the aid rendered by Molly, many settlers would not have borne the earlier trying seasons from 1820 to 1826, and from her ignorance of accounts, many fattened themselves on her goodwill. The writer regretted that her last years were not those of enjoyment of the comforts of life to which she was entitled from the numerous acts of kindness she had evinced to all around her. Despite her fall from prosperity, Molly Morgan has never been forgotten as the Queen of the Hunter Valley. She has been immortalised by Molly Morgan Drive in Maitland, a winery, a homestead, and a motor inn. Over the decades, there have been many mentions in newspapers, magazines, academic articles, history books, and even musicals. As Peter Fitzsimons wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald in 2019, the spirit of Molly Morgan is unconquerable.
Thank you, Jude, for this insight into the life of Molly Morgan. Her name will forever be etched in the history of the Hunter Valley. The next podcast in this series will feature another convict pioneer, Margaret McGreevy. Be sure to join us on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.
Listen for a moment last and hear me tell my tale. How o'er the seas from English shore I was condemned